Fact of the matter is, we absolutely did not plant XY, the informant that's been referred to as XY in this case, in the midst of vulnerable women and girls. That did not happen. He was never tasked to go to these parties or sessions, as they've been referred to in the trial. So not only did we not ask him to do it, there is no evidence that he actually did do it, because if you look in detail at the judge's assessment and the judge's ruling and finding, the legal finding in this case, there is no evidence whatsoever that he was involved or engaged in offending against these victims or indeed anybody else. So it does beg a belief it didn't happen.
OK, just by way of clarification, is it true that your informer's handlers asked him to take vulnerable children to parties? Is that true?
I can't go into the detail of what we did or didn't do with deployments. What I can say is that we absolutely did not task him to go to parties with vulnerable women and girls. That did not happen. We were very, very clear, very specific about that. And I think there's been a sort of drawing away from the central point here. The use of the informant was principally about finding out who might be involved, the cars they were driving, the addresses they were living at, who might be using drugs, who might be supplying those drugs. So it's very much the case that this was the starting point for an investigation. It never resulted in XY being exposed to offending of any form whatsoever. Had it done so, then there'd been one of two outcomes, only one of two outcomes. He'd either have been giving evidence against the people who were convicted, which he didn't, or he'd have been in the dock alongside of them, which he wasn't.
Well, that's the Chief Constable of Northumbria Police defending some of the ways in which they conducted their investigation. Let's speak now to former Chief Prosecutor for the North West of England, NAZIR AFZAL. He was instrumental in convicting the Rochdale grooming gang, and he joins us live from Salford. Very good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
What do you make of Northumbria Police's defence of their use and their paying of a man who had been convicted of a sex offence against a minor?
Well, firstly, let me congratulate them for bringing these individuals to justice. I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that this ultimately was a successful outcome. In relation to the paid informant, I have my concerns, and they're shared obviously by the NSPCC and others, that you would not necessarily want to put a child sex offender with other child sex offenders alone with children, because I don't know how you could manage that risk, and that ultimately is why you would not want to do it. There are other options. I'd like to know whether or not, I'm sure we all want to know, whether they considered surveillance, whether they considered technical options such as listening devices, and whether they considered an undercover officer, which of course they could manage. Also, why not an informant that doesn't have previous convictions for child sexual abuse? So there are a number of options that they ought to have considered, or may well have considered, but we don't know. At the end of the day, this person didn't provide any reliable evidence. We know that because the judge said so. We also know this person nearly completely destroyed this case, because the abuse of process application was made by the defence, alleging that the case was no longer credible because of his involvement. Thankfully, the judge didn't drop the case or order the case to be dismissed, but the judge did order that this person's evidence couldn't be used. And so we have to recognise that it's very dangerous territory. And I know from experience, sadly, that child sex abusers don't immediately change their behaviours, often prosecuting them when they're in their 70s and their 80s. And so the reality is that just because he was convicted doesn't mean that he's going to suddenly have seen the light and not be involved in this kind of activity. And what the Chief Constable is quite rightly saying is that, yes, he wasn't tasked to do any of this stuff, but the reality is that he told the court at that hearing that he went to these parties. He said that, quote unquote, he left because he knew what was happening. But, you know, we're putting ourselves in a situation where we don't know how much danger those young people are in, and particularly with his involvement, undoubtedly this could have sidetracked the case tremendously.
Thanks for your thoughts on that. I wonder if I can ask you, we're going to broaden this out now. I'd like you to stay there, please, and listen to some comments made today by the Labour Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities, Sarah Champion. She's been talking about this case, but she's been talking about the wider context, and she says it is time now to deal with, in effect, what she thinks is the problem. And she says we have now got to illustrate that this is hundreds of men, Pakistani men, who are being convicted of this crime. Let's listen to what she had to say this morning.
I just can't believe that we're here doing the same story in a different town, and this is going to keep going on and on and on until we actually grasp the nettle. What we need to be looking at is why this specific crime is occurring, and this specific crime is organised gangs of predominantly Pakistani British men who are going out and looking for vulnerable children, predominantly girls, grooming, exploiting, trafficking, abusing them across the country. And what frustrates me is that we're not going to the root of the problem. We're not protecting our children properly so that they understand about this crime. But also, we now have probably hundreds of these perpetrators in jail. So let's start doing some research. The government needs to pay some money to do some research and see what are the commonalities that are happening. Because it's not rocket science. You know, this is a specific group of men that are doing this crime. So let's understand why, you know, what are the drivers? What can we do to prevent it in the future? Because I don't want to be sitting here in another 6 months with another town.
Sarah Champion there. NAZIR AFZAL, a specific group of men, she says.
I mean, Sarah's been talking about this subject quite rightly for the last 6 years. I have too. And I, in fact, gave evidence to Parliament, the Home Affairs Select Committee in 2012, and called for this research because I thought there was an issue here. It's not the issue. I mean, the reality is the availability and vulnerability of young girls is the issue, the fact that these perpetrators take advantage of that. But disproportionately, when it comes to this type of sex offending, group grooming, Asian men, Pakistani men are disproportionately involved, and that has to be an issue for us. I've tried to understand it myself, you know, whether it's the nighttime economy, whether there is some cultural baggage that needs to be addressed. The reality is, yes, we need to explore this in more detail. I've said before, and I'll say it again, lift over a stone and you'll find this kind of abuse happening up and down the country. The vast majority of children are more likely to be abused in their homes or in institutions or online. But when it comes to street grooming, Pakistani men, men from South Asian backgrounds are disproportionately involved. Why? Let's find out why.
What I suppose finding out why is the important part of addressing my next question. But what could be done specifically to address what you've clearly set out there as a major part of the issue here?
Well, it's really complicated. So part of the issue is sex education or relationship education, or the lack of it. Too many people I'm Pakistani myself, British Pakistani, born here, but people don't want their children to learn this at school. A lot of young men are forced into marriage or forced to have arranged marriages or have arranged marriages, and then they look for sex elsewhere, to put it bluntly. All of those kinds of there's cultural issues here. There are lack of education, lack of awareness. Yes, there is a sizable amount of work happening within these communities to stop it happening in the future, but my concern is that once this case is over and done with and sentencing has happened, people move on to another subject. No, we have to be relentless in tackling this issue. That means all the communities, and particularly the Pakistani and South Asian communities where these perpetrators in the main come from. Otherwise, sadly, we'll have another one of these cases in a few weeks' time and then be asking the same questions.
NAZIR AFZAL, former Chief Prosecutor, thank you very much indeed for joining us.